Hello, my name is Alex. I'm 28 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and weigh about 120 pounds. I have small but perky 34B breasts and a firm round butt. I'm married with 3 kids, but I keep fit and I'd like to think I look damn good. Before I married my current husband, I had very little sexual experience. In fact, I've only done something sexual 4 times, with 2 different guys and once with one of my girlfriends. So, before starting a relationship with my future husband, I was still quite inexperienced. We had only been dating for a few weeks before our first session of pleasure and hand touching, and it was only a few months before we had real sex for the first time. It was fantastic, and I was quickly hooked. For the rest of our lives, we had sex regularly, at least 3-4 times a week, and sometimes several times a day. We experimented, got a little weird, and tried almost everything each of us could imagine. This went on for a little over a year before I cheated on him for the first time. This was at my first job. I met an attractive guy a couple of years older than me, and he really turned me on. He wasn't very smart, ambitious, or funny, but he was easy to watch. Plus, being stuck at a grocery store job for 4-6 hours with nothing to do but flirt, it was easy for me to fall in love with him, especially when I noticed his rather large package bulging out of his pants while we were talking. Suffice to say, we ended up dating once or twice, but that's a story for another day. The only thing that is important about this experience in relation to today's story is that it is the first time I cheated on my potential husband, the first time he caught me, and the first time he forgave me, so it's really his fault that it wasn't the last time. Fast forward to about 4 years later. I was married to my boyfriend and we had 2 children. I was happy and my husband was definitely good in bed, so I had great sex almost whenever I wanted it. We both worked at the same factory on the same shift, so our schedules fit perfectly and we could easily maintain an active sex life. We had a nice apartment, we made a lot of money, so life was good. One day, my husband, who had been saving money, opened his own business because he did not want to work in a factory all his life. After working in a factory and running a startup for a few months, he felt confident enough to leave his factory job and devote himself entirely to his business. Things took off, and soon he began to earn almost twice as much as before at the factory. During this time, he also decided that he could use some more knowledge, so he decided to go back to school to get a business degree. So now my wonderful husband, who was a wonderful father, was in college full-time and running a successful small business. It was great, we had a lot of money, he was happier, and he always had time for our little children. The only problem was how long it took. Between working 10-12 hours a day and late-night online classes, we had very little time for intimacy. Soon we were having sex once or less per week. It was still great, and he always made sure I had fun at least once, but it wasn't enough for me. I started to get a little angry at him for this, but I didn't want him to leave the business because there was a lot of money and stability, so I didn't think much of it. This all went on for about a year before I cheated again. He was back in action, and this time it was a little different. Last time I was really attracted to the guy I cheated with. This time it was very far from the truth. I worked as a line worker in a large factory. Most of the line workers at this plant are women because it is a lower paid but less physically demanding job. However, there are a few guys who choose this because they aren't the most impressive specimens on their own. My target was one of them. His name was Tom. He was working in the same direction as me, was quiet and a bit nerdy, always talking about Fortnite and other similar games, but I could tell he probably wasn't getting anything. So I thought that he would be an easy target because I was not looking for a husband, but just good sex. I started flirting with him, but not very subtly. I would put on a lot more makeup, bend over in front of him, sometimes bend over to pick something up, and literally rub my ass against his groin before blushing and apologizing. So it took me less than a week before we talked openly about sex at work. All that remained was to find time. I told my husband that I was going ice skating with a school friend. He asked if I wanted to do a family outing and we could take the kids along. This came dangerously close to ruining my carefully laid plans. I got a little angry and replied that I just wanted a night alone where I could have some alone time. He apologized and said everything would be okay and he would stay home with the kids. I felt a little guilty knowing that I was leaving my family, that I really enjoyed having sex with a virtual stranger, but I was already interested, so I took my things and left. I met my date at his home in a small apartment not far from the factory where we worked. I was glad we went out because his house looked like a dump. We rode around for a while, looking for a good place to stop and talk. I was a little hungry, so I asked if he wanted to go out to eat, but he seemed really nervous and just said he didn't have any money anyway, so we just kept looking for a place to park. Eventually, we did get to a big skating rink in a town near where I lived and found a dark, secluded area where there were no other cars parked, and I stopped there. I left the car running because it was pretty cold outside, but I turned off the lights and we both climbed over the center console to sit in the back seat. I wanted to start right away because I really didn't want it to take that long, but he was clearly very nervous, and I really think it was his first time with a woman or anything, judging by the way he behaved. He wanted to kiss at first, but I wasn't there for it, and he had pretty bad breath, so after a few seconds of light kissing, I pulled away and told him to take his pants off. He turned his back to me, at least as well as he could in the cramped space of the car we were in, and after fiddling with his pants for a bit, he began to pleasure himself. I was definitely very turned on by this whole situation. She sat in the back seat of the car and felt a little strange. In front of her was a man whom she saw for the first time in her life, and she could not understand why she was in this situation in the first place. The situation seemed both absurd and bewitching, as if she had unwittingly found herself in the script of some poorly written movie, where the main character finds herself in moments that she certainly did not plan for. And to be honest, she never thought her evening would go like this. He was the most ordinary guy. So ordinary that he could probably be described as typical guy number 3 in the credits of some teen series. But something about this meeting awakened in her a strange feeling that something important was about to happen. Although, if you think about it, it was not so much a desire as curiosity. The understanding that something new was ahead, and that she herself had decided to take part in it, was exciting and alarming at the same time. She tried to understand what exactly attracted her to this guy. Maybe it was because it was an opportunity to do something completely new, to step outside the box and experience something completely different. A feeling of curiosity overpowered all other thoughts. She didn't feel any romance or deep feelings. Everything was too fleeting and temporary, like a Ferris wheel ride that would soon end. The guy, apparently, tried to show his best side. His behavior, however, was so constrained that it seemed that he himself did not fully understand what exactly was happening. This amused her slightly and made her wonder, why did she even end up in this car with a complete stranger? Frankly, she was a little uncomfortable with his inexperience, but this awkwardness only fueled her curiosity. The thought was constantly spinning in my head. Well, what if there is something in this? Every minute her interest in what was happening grew, although logic told her that this was not at all the situation to which she was accustomed. She was used to something else, to confidence, to the fact that everything was going according to plan, and not to this set of awkward actions and attempts to do something right. But there was something special about this improvisation and spontaneity. It was an experiment, a kind of game where she herself decided when to stop. She couldn't help but compare him to her husband. Her husband was a completely different person, confident, experienced, knowing what she needed and how to give it. Their relationship was stable, predictable, with a lot of love and care. But sometimes this predictability lacked poignancy. This guy, on the contrary, was the complete opposite. His uncertainty and clumsy attempts turned out to be something new, something that aroused interest and even slight excitement in her. She herself wondered why she was so fascinated by it. After several clumsy attempts, he finally gathered his thoughts and decided to take the initiative, but still his actions were far from what she expected. He looked as if he was following instructions that he himself had forgotten. She decided not to waste time and take control into her own hands. If this meeting has already happened, let it at least end without unnecessary suffering. While he was trying to guess what to do next, she already knew that everything would end pretty quickly. His timidity only increased her desire to complete everything quickly. Her head was full of contradictions. She understood that this was far from what she wanted, but curiosity still pushed her to continue. It felt more like a test than a real passion. Trying to please her was not what she was used to. She understood that he lacked experience, and with every minute this became more and more obvious. She tried to guide him somehow, to help him understand what to do, but his uncertainty only widened the gap between what she needed and what was happening. He couldn't find the right rhythm, his movements were too chaotic, and at some point she realized that it was time to end this experiment. However, she couldn't help but notice that there was something special about it all. Of course, it was not something great or impressive, but the very knowledge that she had disrupted the usual course of things gave her some kind of sense of power. She knew that she would return home to a calm and stable life with her husband, but this short episode became something of a break for her, an unexpected pause in her usual routine. When it was finally over, she realized that she had not received any satisfaction that could be compared to what she had experienced before. But this evening still left a mark on her. She took him home, saying goodbye to him as if it were something random and temporary, without further words or explanations. It was just a chapter that closed on its own. Her journey home was full of thoughts. She thought about her husband, who was probably already asleep. It was his usual evening work, TV, and maybe a light dinner before bed. But her evening turned out to be completely different. She decided to take a shower to wash off the remnants of this strange adventure. In the shower, she stood for a long time under the streams of water, feeling the fatigue gradually disappear. Thoughts about what had happened swirled in her head, although she could not fully understand why it affected her so much. Her mind seemed to be split in two. On the one hand, she felt guilty for her actions. On the other, it was so unexpected and wrong that it awakened a new wave of emotions in her. It's been a few weeks since I first met Tom. I was still incredibly turned on by what happened that night, not because it would be memorable in itself or because the sex was great, but because it was actually the wrongness of my actions that turned me on. I knew I had broken every rule in my marriage and did it with a guy I worked with almost every day. In my head, this fantasy only grew over time. I attributed his poor performance to nerves and inexperience and was confident that he would improve significantly over time, so I looked forward to our next date. During this time, I continued to have sex with my husband, mainly to keep up appearances and not arouse his suspicion, but I began to be angry with him all the time. Every little thing he did or said would piss me off, and I would just add it to my reasons for cheating. Of course, years later, and even now, I understand that I was not angry with him, but felt guilty, but then I did not realize it, and all this pushed me forward, straight into the arms of other men. I continued to flirt and talk openly about sex with Tom at work, but also increased my general cheekiness. I flirted with almost anyone who paid attention to me, and there were a lot of them, since it was a factory, and that kind of work seems to attract a certain type of person. However, I noticed that most men did not want to go beyond flirting. When I brought up sexually explicit topics, many would nod politely and then avoid me. Several people said things like, "No offense, but I'm married," and explained that they didn't feel comfortable discussing such things while in a relationship. Now, years later, I even respect them for being stronger than me and remaining faithful, but at the time these men only added to my disdain for loyalty. I was horny and willing to seek sexual gratification at almost any cost, and I wanted that to be true for everyone around me. Thus, despite the wide cast of the net, so far only Tom remained a lover for me. It wasn't that I missed the thrill of sex with him. Now that we had already slept together, our conversations became more frank and sexually intense, which several times made me physically aroused right at work. I found as many opportunities as possible to touch him. I especially enjoyed rubbing my ass against him at every opportunity, and a couple of times when no one was looking, I stroked the front of his pants. Of course, such moments were rare, since many people worked at the factory. And Tom didn't want us to get caught and lose his job, so even when I suggested trying something riskier at work, He always refused and said, "Not at work." I was annoyed that we couldn't have sex more often, because that would be the main benefit of having my lover work with me. But we started planning our second date. He didn't want me to come to his house, and I, of course, couldn't invite him to mine. I suggested we go to a hotel, but he said he didn't want to spend money on a room if we couldn't stay there for the night. So I decided to try to organize a sleepover with him. That night, I went home to my husband and started talking about staying the night at a friend's house on the Friday after a group party. Now I understand how stupid this sounds for a grown married woman with children, but at the time it seemed like a pretty good excuse for not spending the night at home. However, this apparently aroused my husband's suspicions as he immediately refused. He said he didn't mind me going to a party and hanging out with my friends, but he didn't think it was right for me to stay overnight at someone else's house. He didn't seem suspicious of my intentions, but rather worried about my safety. Of course, this made me angry because not only did I want to spend the night with Tom and hoped that he would calm down a little and perform better in bed, but again I felt incredible guilt for lying and cheating, which made me even more angry with my husband. I tried to play it cool and said I probably wouldn't go then, hoping to get my husband to change his mind, but it didn't work. We never returned to this issue. When Friday arrived, Tom and I agreed that we would go on a short date again since nothing else would work out. We decided that I would pick him up again, and this time we would go to the movies. When I got home after work, I quickly showered, shaved, and got ready for the date. When my husband returned home with the children, he greeted me and invited everyone to have dinner together. I was angry with him and thought that he had some kind of sixth sense that was interfering with my plans, but I simply said that he could do what he wanted, and I was going to the movies with my friend Ashley. My husband then asked what movie we were going to see, and when I said it was rated R, he offered to take the girls to his mom's and go to the movies with me. I began to get nervous that my plans were about to be ruined, so I began to press on with guilt. I said that I just wanted to spend time with my friends and be alone a little, adding that I spend all my time either at work or with my family, and I have the right to rest a little. He agreed and wished me a good time, saying that he would stay at home and have fun with the children. I felt guilty as I got dressed, put on my makeup and left, but that was far from how I should have felt. I should have canceled the date and stayed home and had fun with my family, but I didn't. I didn't even say goodbye when I walked out the door. I met Tom outside his apartment, and he jumped into the car. I went to the theater since there was very little time left before it started. We talked a little on the way, but the trip was short, and I was pretty upset, but I didn't want to show it. The theater in our city is quite large and has leather seats with a folding center console so they can act as a sofa. And it's quite cool there, so people often bring blankets with them. Well, that's exactly what we did. My husband's brother was working in theater at the time, so I knew I would have to be careful. Tom and I went separately and met at the theater. We climbed under the covers and waited for the movie to start. As the previews aired and the theater began to fill, my anger lingered and my excitement grew. There weren't many people in the theater, and there was no one around us, so I leaned into Tom's ear and whispered that it was time for us to get started. He nervously placed his hand on my thigh, and even that light touch was enough to make me move forward. I expected him to raise his hand and get to work, but he was either too nervous or didn't know what to do. So I knew I needed to take action. I unbuttoned my pants, pulled them down to my knees, and just sat there in my silky black panties, under the covers of course. Then I lifted his hand and put it on me. He started playing with me, slowly at first, but gradually increasing the game. This went on for about 15 to 20 minutes, and I won't lie, although it wasn't the best technical demonstration of skills, it was still very erotic to have someone other than my husband fondle me through my panties in such a public place. However, I became very horny and needed to either stop or escalate the situation before I started to become sensitive and too sore to continue. After a while, as tension began to build between us, things became a little more obvious. We were no longer just next to each other as two people who decided to spend the evening together. It was something different, a special closeness arose between us, something subtle and almost tangible. I felt his hand lightly touch my body again and again, as if he was looking for confirmation that this was acceptable, that I did not mind. And of course I wasn't. I wasn't in a hurry. I wasn't in a hurry. Everything developed naturally, with that slowness that makes such moments especially meaningful. At some point, I took his hand and directed it to where I wanted to feel more warmth, more of his presence. It was intimate, but without any rough intent or urgency. His touch was tentative at first, but that was its own charm. He tried, but I noticed that he didn't quite understand what exactly I needed. At such moments, it's always a little awkward. On the one hand, you want to relax and trust, but on the other, you understand that if you don't help him, don't show him what and how, the moment may slip away. And I, of course, decided to help him, carefully guiding him so that he would better understand what needs to be done. Gently taking his hand, I moved it to where it was needed. Trying not to ruin the atmosphere, I explained to him what exactly pleased me, how to move, and where to direct my efforts. I spoke softly, without any criticism, just as if I was sharing a secret with him. After all, who knows his body better if not me? We continued, and each time his movements became more confident, although I still had to guide him a little. At some point, I realized that his touches became more decisive, and we were becoming more and more immersed in the process. But suddenly it dawned on me. The film is still running, and we have clearly already stopped noticing it. The whole world around seemed to narrow down to this one moment, to the two of us. I started thinking about what it looked like from the outside. Two adults sitting in silence, but completely focused on each other, ignoring everything that was happening on the screen. Soon I felt that the situation was developing a little faster than planned. He moved closer and quietly whispered to me that he couldn't hold it in any longer, that his feelings were about to get out of control. Naturally, this got me thinking. I needed to somehow carefully get out of the situation without ruining the moment, but also without letting it end in some awkward incident. We both understood that there was no need to rush, and I suggested that he slow down a little. This was the moment when you realize that control and trust are key. We turned our attention to each other again and began to move a little slower, giving ourselves the opportunity to truly feel what was happening between us. We were both absorbed in this process, and I tried to make sure that he did not feel any awkwardness, that everything would go naturally and harmoniously. When it was all over and we came to our senses again, we were enveloped in a pleasant feeling of completion. When the movie ended, we quickly parted ways, and I left first, and he followed a few minutes later. We met near my car and waited for the crowd to clear. Once there were no more people in the movie theater parking lot, we pulled out of our spot and drove across the street into the old shopping center parking lot, empty and dark. I found the most secluded place and turned off the car. Tom didn't seem interested in continuing since he had already used up his load tonight, but I said I wasn't done yet and that I needed to have real sex to get my money's worth for the night. We climbed into the back and got to work. I started everything because it was already late and I needed to go home. Somehow, without further ado, we both started taking off our clothes. Everything happened slowly, as if in slow motion, as if time had stood still, and even the echoes of distant cars ceased to be important. My clothes, jeans, a little tight but quite comfortable, went into the back seat. He also took off his, and we both stood in front of each other, like two actors ready for the main scene. There was no tension, everything was natural. We understood each other without words. Every gesture said more than any phrases could. The suggestion to try something new wasn't all that surprising. Yes, this may seem like a bold experiment to some, but for us, it was more of a natural continuation of intimacy. We both knew our sizes, and to be honest, it only worked to our advantage. The position I suggested might not seem the most comfortable to some, but as they say, we had our own reasons for choosing it. Something like a physical compromise, and everything turned out to be surprisingly convenient. He lay on his back, relaxed, and I positioned myself so that both he and I were comfortable. To be honest, it felt almost like a game. On the one hand, tenderness, on the other slight awkwardness, but that made the moment even sweeter. He began to touch me gently, trying to do everything to make me feel good. Let's just say that his efforts were not the height of perfection, but still, as they say, it is not always a matter of technique. The desire itself is important. I, in turn, focused on helping him relax and letting him know that we were here to enjoy the moment and not feel pressured. His movements were careful, and I, watching him, gradually became involved in the process. Our breaths merged into a single rhythm, and I felt a real connection being established between us. No, it wasn't some mega perfect Hollywood moment of passion where everything goes swimmingly, but that's the thing. Reality is always a little unpredictable. We moved carefully, listening to each other. There were times when it seemed like the rhythm was going away, that the tempo was being lost, but instead of worrying, we just laughed about it. I suddenly realized that in such situations, laughter is the best reaction. This takes the pressure off and brings us back to the point. This is not a competition, this is just us enjoying each other's company. When I changed my position, everything seemed to fall into place again. At that moment, everything seemed natural, as if we knew this choreography a long time ago. I began to move slowly, feeling him adjust to the new position, and everything seemed to be in its place again. The pace gradually increased, and I felt that we were getting closer to the end. But as happens in life, there are always moments of unexpected stops. At some point, he lost his breath, slightly lost his rhythm. This was not a problem, but of course, when you are in such a moment, any changes are felt much more strongly than in ordinary life. He paused briefly, trying to return to the rhythm, and I, not wanting to lose momentum, took the initiative. Turning around, I was again in a position where I could control the situation. I wanted this moment to be special for both of us, so I did everything to maintain the momentum. We both knew the end was near. I felt waves of pleasure rolling in, and to be honest, I was no longer thinking about anything other than completing everything with dignity. I continued to move, even when I felt that he could no longer maintain the same pace. When it was all over, there was that silence that always happens after such moments. Silence filled with contentment and slight fatigue. We both knew it wasn't ideal, but we made it through. There was a slight mess, and I, laughing, took napkins to clean everything up. We tidied ourselves up carefully, helping each other, and that was part of what made this moment special. When everything was finished, I got dressed again and, looking back at him, helped him pack his things with a slight smile. We sat in the car, looked at each other, and everything seemed surprisingly calm. This moment seemed to be the completion of something important, not physically, but emotionally. We thanked each other oddly enough, such words seemed natural, and from that moment on, it seems to me that we became a little closer to each other. I drove him back to the apartment, and before he came out he said he had something to tell me. He recently started dating someone, and he really liked her. I immediately got angry and felt that he was cheating on me. Now, I don't understand how absurd it was, but I was angry and betrayed. He assured me that we could maintain our relationship and that nothing needed to change. I just said good night and went home. On the way home, I reflected and reflected on how I had been betrayed and realized that there was an easily accessible source of vengeance waiting for me at home. So I rushed home as quickly as possible. When I got there, I quickly parked the car and went inside. It was about 11 p.m., so I thought my husband was sleeping, but I was surprised to find that he was awake on the couch and watching TV. He turned off the TV and looked at me as I entered. I immediately noticed that he had cleaned the house and everything looked great. He told me that he put the kids to bed before bed and that they were already asleep. I was literally overcome with guilt for what I had done that night, as well as anger. Mostly anger at Tom for changing me, but also anger at my husband for not catching me and, ironically, for being caring and loving. I decided that the best course of action would be sex. In front of him, I suddenly felt strangely vulnerable and decided on a spontaneous act. I knelt down in front of him and, almost mechanically, looked him over, appreciating what I had not noticed for so long. He stood relaxed, but impressive. I looked at him with a new feeling, as if for the first time, although I knew every detail of him perfectly. I just held it for a while, Thinking, and then, without wasting any time, I began to act. I knew he was surprised by my initiative because it didn't happen often, but his body soon responded. Everything went smoothly, I was in no hurry, but I felt how he was quickly becoming more and more excited. When everything became clear, I stopped, looked up, and felt that it was time to move on. I took him to the bedroom. He suggested that I do something quieter, but I decided not to waste time on persuasion. I quickly got rid of my clothes and lay down next to him, feeling him next to me. He noticed a small detail that made me smile. He didn't like kissing me after I was so close to him. This amused me a little, but didn't knock me out of the mood. We continued, and soon I already felt how our unity was becoming deeper and more passionate. We moved together, understanding each other without words. After a while, I felt the release approaching and allowed myself to relax, completely surrendering to this moment. When it was over, I rolled over and let him finish what he started, feeling his movements and enjoying every moment. Finally, he too came to his end, and I felt him relax next to me. Everything was perfect. Every moment was perfect in its simplicity and naturalness. To say goodbye, I took a photo, a small souvenir from this evening, a memorable moment that I shared with Tom simply by sending him a photo without further ado. It was a calm, quiet ending to a busy day, after which I was finally able to fall asleep, content and peaceful. After sending the photo to Tom, I received no reply that night and no messages for the rest of the weekend. I was a little worried that I had gone too far and that he would break things off with me or, worse, expose me. After all, he had enough dirt on me to cause serious problems. We had hundreds, if not thousands, of sexually explicit messages that he could use against me, not to mention the several dozen extremely graphic photos and videos he had of me. I realized that I had virtually no control over what would happen next. He could have spread it all around at work, and soon everyone would have known what I was doing, or he could have sent it all directly to my husband, and it would have really messed things up for me. I couldn't believe how stupid I was. Not only did I give him everything he needed to ruin my life, but I also laughed at him and sent this photo to embarrass him. Needless to say, I didn't have a very good weekend. When I returned to work on Monday, some of my fears were alleviated. Nobody mentioned anything unusual. There were no aside comments, not even casual glances. I was almost sure that no one knew anything. I didn't see Tom at all that day, or even for most of the week, as we were in different parts of the plant and not working together. On Friday that week, we were in the same area, but we didn't have time to talk at all, so I didn't have a chance to see what the situation really was. During the break, I texted him to see if he was mad, and he said no. Just in case, I went to the bathroom, took a photo of my breasts for him, and captioned it, "I'm so sorry." He opened it, but never answered. Later that evening, I texted him a few more times, but he didn't even open the messages. Another long, anxious weekend will pass, but on Monday, we were again waiting on the same line. I quickly took the opportunity to get some answers. I asked him why I felt like he was avoiding me, not responding to my harshness, and not responding to me at night. Here, Tom was letting me know that now that he has a girlfriend, he doesn't have time to talk to me outside of work, and he doesn't want to risk his girlfriend finding out about me because he really liked her. This was actually really painful to hear, and I know it's probably just the narcissist in me, but I thought he liked me. I knew I was mostly using him for quick sexual gratification, but I actually thought I was more than that to him. I acted like I was okay with it and said we'd keep it casual, but I started avoiding him for a while, hoping that if I backed down, he'd come after me. Unfortunately, he didn't. In fact, it was as if he had flipped a switch and was once again a casual acquaintance in the workplace. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was just normal workplace small talk. He never went any further, and when I tried, he didn't interfere. The only thing I could get away with was physical contact, so from time to time, I would brush my butt against him or bend over in front of him, and from time to time, I would even reach for his groin. He would have let me get away with it anyway, but it seemed like everything else was over. This went on for the better part of 2 months, during which time I met someone new at work. His name was Eric. He was new there and didn't know much about me, so I was able to play the innocent. I talked to him, and at first he was very friendly and just came across as a nice guy who wanted to make me laugh and smile. And I played an innocent young wife without much experience. He took the bait, and soon I was immersed in my second novel at work, one that would be both much better and much worse than the first. But that's another story. But for now, suffice it to say that I gave Tom a lot of space and spent a couple of months in another place. Tom was still dating the same girl, and it seemed like things were getting serious. He even got her a job there. I recognized her a little, but tried to stay away so as not to get too close. First of all, I was a little jealous of the attention she was getting, because not only was she pretty, but she also had bigger breasts than me and didn't have the reputation of being a prostitute, so most guys actually paid attention to her. But the most unpleasant thing was that she did not reciprocate their feelings. She only wanted Tom. She didn't even flirt back. She was never rude or caused a scene, but she clearly outlined her boundaries, which she did not cross. I hated her for this. She was everything I wasn't. She was loyal, got a lot of attention, had big and perky breasts, but most importantly, she seemed very happy. And I wasn't happy. I had a husband who loved me and made enough money to suggest that I not work at all. We lived in a nice big apartment in a good area. We had 2 new cars and 2 happy and healthy children, but it wasn't enough. I had 2 lovers at work, and in addition to what I received at home, I could count on other men to satisfy my needs and various desires. But I wasn't happy, and that's why I didn't want her not to be happy either. It would make me happy. I decided the obvious route was to set up a date with Tom again. I was a little nervous, mainly because my other lover, Eric, was jealous of everything I did with anyone other than him, including my husband. He made fun of me and threatened me if he thought I had slept with anyone else. In addition, my husband was clearly beginning to suspect that something was going on, since I was already having a hard time keeping all my false stories together, and several times certain clues slipped past my attention. But I wasn't going to let any of this stop me, because I had already decided that I would get what I wanted, no matter the consequences. The next day at work, I walked straight up to Tom and, without saying a word, grabbed him through his pants and kissed him on the lips. He instantly jumped back and looked around to make sure no one had seen. When he was sure that there was no one around, he came closer to me and asked what was wrong with me. He was angry, not only because I had broken his off-duty rule, but also because I now risked his girlfriend finding out. I wasted no time and made my intentions clear. Tonight we will meet, and we will have sex the way I want, when I want, and as much as I want. At first he objected, saying that he had a date with a girl, but I threatened to send her all our messages, as well as photos of us having sex. He begged me not to do this, and even offered money to leave him alone, but I refused. Then he pretended to be sick, left work early, and canceled his date under the same pretext. In the evening, when I was about to leave, my husband asked to talk to me. I said I didn't have much time, but he insisted. He directly said that he knew something was going on, and that it had to stop. I pretended like I didn't understand what he was talking about. He said that I understood perfectly, and when I looked into his eyes, I had no doubt. He was sure that I was lying to him, and I think he even knew that I was leaving right then and there to sleep with another man. I stood my ground. I pretended to be innocent and said that nothing was going on and suggested we talk when I got back. When he didn't respond, I promised to make amends when I returned and left. I didn't go straight to Tom's house because I was worried that my husband might be watching me. When I arrived at Tom's house, he was waiting for me on the street corner, so I stopped and he quickly got into the car. I leaned in to kiss him, but he said, "Not here." We went out of town to a small park where I had already been for the same purpose. When I parked, Tom started saying that he didn't want to continue our relationship anymore, but I wasn't going to listen to him. I told him that either we start right now or he leaves, and I send everything to his girlfriend. Reluctantly, he climbed into the back seat, and I followed. He obviously wanted to get this over with as quickly as possible because he pulled down his sweatpants and boxers. Even though he acted indifferent and protested, He was incredibly excited. It was then that I realized that a man may hate you or at least want nothing to do with you, but one place will betray him. We were sitting in the car, everything around seems ordinary, almost boring, but as you know, appearances can be deceiving. Tom was nearby, and to be honest, I didn't quite understand what we were doing here. The situation was tense from the very beginning. I can't say that I was delighted with what was happening, but since we had come so far, it was necessary to somehow bring the matter to an end. I usually prefer that the man takes all the important steps. I love the feeling of him leading and me just following, enjoying his determination. But today was clearly not the case. Tom looked distant, like he wasn't completely there. His gaze was directed somewhere into the distance, as if what was happening didn't bother him at all. And it was at that moment that I realized that if I didn't take control of the situation, nothing would happen. So I gathered all my resolve and decided to take action. The place was cramped. The car was not conducive to feeling comfortable, but there was no choice. I moved a little closer to him, trying to find at least a minimally comfortable position. The car, of course, is not the best choice for such things, but what can you do? It became obvious that if someone did not take the initiative, our evening would end completely boring and mundane without any emotions. This was not a situation where you could rely on anyone else. Today I was driving. Tom was somehow out of place. At first I thought that maybe it was just his mood. Sometimes people can be a little self-absorbed. But the more time passed, the more I realized he simply didn't care. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but his absolute indifference was starting to weigh on me. Nevertheless, I continued my attempts to somehow revive this moment. The position we found ourselves in left much to be desired. The angle was awkward, and it became immediately obvious. Any movement seemed a little forced, but I tried my best. As I tried to even out the rhythm, the idea that Tom most likely did not share my efforts became more and more obvious. He was here physically, but not emotionally. Every time I looked at his face, it seemed to me that he was somewhere far away, as if his thoughts were now in a completely different place. If it weren't for me, he probably wouldn't even continue. This, of course, was unpleasant, but by that time I had already resigned myself to the idea that I would have to carry everything myself. At first it seemed to me that I could find some kind of rhythm that would suit both of us, but no matter how hard I tried, everything turned out awkward. To be honest, the awkward position and limited space in the car didn't contribute much to success. But I didn't give up. I continued to look for the best angle, trying to achieve at least some result. Tom seemed to still be somewhere on his wavelength, not reacting too much to my efforts. It seemed as if all this could go on forever, an endless cycle of attempts and efforts that still did not lead to anything tangible. At some point, tired of my unsuccessful attempts, I decided to take another step. I tried to focus on my own feelings in order to somehow compensate for the situation. It seemed to me that something was finally starting to work out, when suddenly everything changed dramatically. As if in an instant, Tom decided that it was his turn to act. His passivity suddenly changed to something completely opposite. He suddenly grabbed me by the hips, and his movements became fast and sharp, so much so that I didn't even have time to understand what was happening. He seemed to be trying to make up for all his previous inaction. My attempts to follow his pace were futile. He acted so violently and quickly that I simply stopped understanding how to react. It was not a moment that was enjoyable. Rather, it felt mechanical and even painful. I thought that everything would end soon, and my guesses were justified. Tom suddenly stopped abruptly, stood tense for a moment, and I realized that everything was really coming to an end. At this point, I was ready to just breathe a sigh of relief. However, it didn't end there. Instead of finishing calmly, Tom pulled away abruptly, pushing me aside. I suddenly hit the car door, and it was so sudden that I was even scared for a moment. A thought flashed through my head. What if this is a sign of something more? I found myself in such a situation that I didn't know what to expect next. But as it turned out, there was nothing to wait for. Tom took no further steps. He just abruptly took out his phone and started typing something, as if everything that happened didn't matter to him. He seemed completely engrossed in his screen. At the first moment, I thought that perhaps he was writing to his girlfriend, trying to somehow justify himself or hush up what had happened. This seemed quite logical to me, considering how disinterested he had been acting the entire time. I sat there, confused, and tried to comprehend what had just happened. It was one of those moments when you feel empty and have absolutely no idea why all this was necessary. I sat down and asked if he was ready for round two, but suddenly he threw the phone at me. It was my phone. He apparently pulled it out when he started to dominate. Tom deleted all our correspondence, all photographs and videos in which we were together. He even deleted his and her numbers from my phone. He then said that we were done with him and he didn't want to talk to me anymore. I threatened that I would still tell his girlfriend, even without proof. But he calmly continued to get dressed and said that he had already told her everything, and that she knew exactly where he was right now. I started to panic, fearing that he would betray me and tell my husband everything. Tom explained that he had deleted everything I had ever sent him a long time ago because the whole communication disgusted him from the very beginning. He admitted that the reason he had trouble getting aroused on the first two dates was because he felt guilty about sleeping with someone else's wife. He was horny and wasn't getting sex, so he went for it. But every time he saw my face, he almost immediately lost his excitement because he knew I was married. So he always tried to do it in dark places or with my back turned to him. Tom said that from the moment he started dating a girl, the thought of cheating on her made him physically disgusted, and that was why he avoided me. Now everything became clear to me, and I felt worse than ever. This guy, who had just started dating someone, turned out to be 100 times more faithful to her than I was to my husband. That's why he never wanted to invite me to his home, didn't want to spend money on me, and once he found someone better, he was willing to pretend I never existed. I yelled at him to get out of the car, and he just grinned and opened the door. And there his girlfriend stood, next to her car, holding her phone, recording him getting out of my car while I sat in the back seat, half naked. She walked up to the car and told me that if I ever showed up near her boyfriend, she would send this video to everyone she could, including my husband. I tried to bluff by saying that she didn't even know how to find him, but as it turned out, Tom took his number from my phone, and now they both had it. I realized that it was all over. I was a stupid, slutty girl who put everything I had on the line for mediocre sex on the side, and all I got in return was shame, guilt, anger, and humiliation. Well, that's a few emotions, but it doesn't even come close to covering what I've lost. When they left, I closed the door and got dressed. I didn't know what to do except go home. Knowing that this was obviously my last time with Tom, and feeling that I was still aroused, I consoled myself with the thought that I would at least be able to have sex with my husband when I returned. I thought about it all the way home, and when I drove up to our house, it excited me even more. I planned everything. I was going to come in, and he would be sitting on the sofa. I'll go up to him, take off his pants, give him a little pleasure, and then we'll have sex. And if he tastes strange, I'll just say that I'm very horny because it worked before. But when I opened the door, all my plans immediately collapsed. He was indeed sitting on the sofa, but my parents were sitting on the other sofa, the same people I supposedly went to see that evening. My mother was clearly crying, and my father's face showed shame, disappointment, and anger at the same time. But the worst thing was my husband. There was no emotion on his face. He didn't look angry or sad. He definitely didn't cry. He looked as if I no longer existed for him, and that's when I felt it. The feeling that my stomach fell out of me and I was falling backwards into a long, black, endless pit. I lost consciousness. When I came to, my husband and father were lifting me and laying me on the sofa. I didn't know what to expect. But my husband quickly clarified the situation. He said that he called my parents after I didn't answer the phone for several hours. They told him they hadn't seen me for over 2 weeks and asked why he thought they had me. Then he said that I told him that I went to see them and would stay for dinner. After that, they realized that something was wrong and offered to come to us. By the time I returned, my husband had managed to tell them everything he knew, that I regularly left home, and they confirmed that there were at least 2 other cases when I said that I was going to see them, but in fact did not come. That night my husband kicked me out. He said that he could no longer tolerate lies and obvious betrayals, and that he did not even want to look at me. The pain I felt upon hearing those words was proof that none of my affairs had ever mattered to me, and that I had just lost the only man I truly loved. I packed my things and went to live with my parents. They were, of course, very disappointed with me and made it clear that if I continued to behave in the same way, they would kick me out in no time. On the way to them, while they scolded me, I just cried silently and looked at the phone, hoping to see a message from my husband. And so, when we were already approaching our parents' house, I received a notification about the message. I opened my phone, hoping to see my husband's name. It was Eric. No flirting, no photos, just a simple 5-word message. I know what you did. I couldn't stand it. I just turned off the phone, went into the house, fell on the sofa, and burst into tears. It was only the next morning that I realized that I had not thought about the children when I left. I completely forgot about them until this moment. And as I was getting ready for work, I imagined my husband and children sitting at breakfast, like every morning, and I couldn't remember the last time I sat down to eat with them and didn't run straight to work. Now all I wanted was to go back and fix everything. Appreciate what I had, cherish my children and family life, love my husband and only him. But it was already too late. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next one.